The battlefield stretched endlessly before Captain Eli Hawk, a grim landscape littered with broken machines, and the remains of soldiers from both sides. The scent of scorched metal and ozone clung to the air, a constant reminder of the relentless conflict between humanity and the Zera. Eli crouched behind a jagged piece of debris, his pulse racing as the distant sounds of plasma fire echoed across the wasteland. His orders were clear: scout enemy positions, report back, and stay alive. But after years of fighting, the meaning behind those orders had started to blur. What had once been a war to defend his people now felt like a cycle with no end, a struggle driven by ancient grudges neither side seemed willing to abandon. The Zera were supposed to be monsters, ruthless warriors bred for conquest. Yet as Eli stared across the battlefield, he saw no glory in the ruins scattered before him, only desperation and loss. With a sigh, he adjusted his helmet and activated his visor, scanning the horizon for movement. His squad was several clicks away, holding their position at the edge of the combat zone. Alone, in the twilight of the war-torn world, Eli felt more vulnerable than ever. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw movement, a figure slipping through the shadows near an abandoned outpost. His heart quickened as he raised his rifle, training the scope on the target. It was a Zera soldier, moving cautiously, as if trying to avoid detection. Eli hesitated. Something about the way the figure moved didn't match the brutal image he'd always associated with the enemy. This Zera was smaller than the others, with a slender build and fluid grace. Curiosity warred with duty in Eli's mind. He knew he should fire, eliminate the target, but instead, he watched, captivated by the strange sense that this soldier didn't belong on the battlefield any more than he did. The Zera turned suddenly, as if sensing Eli's gaze. For a brief moment, their eyes met through the scopes of their helmets. His cold blue, theirs a striking violet. Time seemed to freeze, and in that instant, Eli felt something shift inside him. He lowered his rifle, and to his surprise, the Zera did the same. Before he could think better of it, Eli stepped out from behind cover, raising his hands slowly to show he meant no harm. The Zera hesitated, glancing around as if expecting a trap, but when no ambush came, they cautiously approached, their weapon lowered, but not discarded. As they drew closer, Eli got his first clear look at the enemy soldier. She was tall, with angular features and a crown of black and silver braids cascading over her shoulders. Her violet eyes gleamed with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. "I should kill you," she said, her voice low and melodic, tinged with the accent of her people. "And you should kill me." Eli nodded. Probably. They stood in silence, two soldiers on opposite sides of a war neither fully understood, bound together by a moment of inexplicable connection. Eli couldn't explain what compelled him to lower his weapon. He only knew that in the presence of this strange, beautiful warrior, the constant weight of the war felt lighter somehow, like a distant echo instead of a suffocating burden. "My name's Eli," he offered quietly, as if speaking his name aloud might bridge the chasm between them. The Zera tilted her head, studying him with cautious curiosity. "Mira," she replied after a moment, her expression softening just enough to suggest that she, too, felt the strange pull between them. They sat together in the shadow of the outpost, hidden from the prying eyes of their comrades, and spoke in halting words, piecing together fragments of understanding. Mira told him about her homeworld, about the towering crystal forests that shimmered beneath twin suns, and the songs her people sang to welcome the changing seasons. Eli shared stories from Earth, painting vivid pictures of blue skies, vast oceans, and city lights that stretched across the horizon like constellations. For the first time in years, Eli found himself laughing, not the bitter, hollow laugh of a soldier who had seen too much, but the genuine laughter of someone remembering what it felt like to be alive. Mira smiled, a rare expression on a face shaped by war, and in that moment, the differences between them seemed insignificant. But as the sky darkened, and the distant sounds of battle grew louder, the reality of their situation settled over them like a cold fog. They were still enemies, still bound by the chains of duty and loyalty to their respective factions. Their brief respite was nothing more than a stolen moment, a fragile connection in the midst of chaos. "I can't stay," Mira whispered, regret flickering in her eyes. "If my people find out about this." Eli nodded, understanding the unspoken threat. "I know, it's the same for me." They stood slowly, reluctant to part but knowing they had no choice. Before she left, Mira reached into the pocket of her armor and pulled out a small, polished stone, a piece of her homeworld, worn smooth by the passage of time. "Take this," she said, pressing the stone into Eli's hand, a reminder that not all of us are monsters. Eli closed his fingers around the stone, feeling its cool weight in his palm. "Will I see you again?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mira hesitated, then gave a small, sad smile. "If we're lucky." And then she was gone, slipping into the shadows as silently as she had appeared. Eli stood alone in the twilight, the polished stone warm against his skin. For the first time in a long while he felt something stir within him, hope, fragile and tentative, like the first light of dawn breaking over a war-torn horizon. The following days passed in a blur of skirmishes and reports, but Eli's mind was elsewhere, replaying every moment of his encounter with Mira. He carried the stone with him, a talisman against the darkness that threatened to consume him. At night he found himself staring at the stars, wondering where she was and if she thought of him too. And then, one night, she appeared again, emerging from the shadows like a dream made flesh. They met in the same place, beneath the shattered remains of the outpost, and shared stories beneath the canopy of stars. The more they talked, the more they realized how much they had in common, how alike their people were, despite the stories they had been told. With each secret meeting, their connection deepened, evolving from fragile curiosity into something far more dangerous, something neither of them dared name aloud. They knew the risks, knew that discovery would mean death for both of them. But in the quiet moments beneath the stars, the war felt distant, like a story told by someone else. They were no longer just soldiers. They were Eli and Mira, two souls caught in the crossfire of a conflict they no longer believed in, bound together by the one thing war could never destroy: love. The days that followed were both agonizing and exhilarating for Eli. Every second spent away from Mira felt like an eternity. Yet every moment with her was stolen from the jaws of danger. Their meetings had become more frequent, but no less perilous. They met beneath the cover of darkness, hidden among the ruins of old outposts, where the war could not find them, if only for a little while. Eli knew that what they were doing was madness, but he couldn't stop. Mira was unlike anyone he had ever met. In her, he found something precious: hope, kindness, and a fierce belief that the war did not have to define them. The bond they shared deepened with every conversation, every glance, every touch. They spoke about their homes, their dreams, and the families they had left behind. Mira told him of her sister, lost in an early skirmish with the humans, and how it had hardened her resolve to fight. Yet now, with Eli by her side, she was beginning to question everything she had been taught. "I thought humans were all monsters," Mira admitted one night, her voice soft in the quiet. "They told us you were incapable of compassion, that you destroyed everything you touched." Eli gave her a sad smile. "We were told the same about you." They sat together under the vast, star-filled sky, the distant sounds of war reduced to a dull murmur in the background. For those stolen moments, the galaxy felt small, and the space between them even smaller. They were no longer two soldiers from warring factions. They were just Eli and Mira, two souls who had found each other in the unlikeliest of places. But the weight of reality was never far away. Every time they parted, Eli felt the sting of fear, fear that someone would discover their secret, fear that this fragile thing between them would shatter. And yet he could not stop himself from returning to her, again and again, as if drawn by an invisible thread that refused to break. Mira seemed to feel it too. One night, after a close call with one of her patrols, she grabbed Eli's hand, her violet eyes wide with fear and determination. "We can't keep doing this forever," she whispered. "One day, someone will find out." "I know," Eli whispered back, brushing a stray braid from her face. "But I can't lose you, Mira." "And I can't lose you," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "But what are we supposed to do? Our people don't have to keep fighting," Eli interrupted, the words spilling out before he could stop them. What if we could end this, together?" Mira stared at him, her expression a mix of hope and disbelief. "Eli, you can't be serious. The war has been going on for decades. One romance isn't going to change that." "It's not just a romance," Eli said fiercely. "It's proof that we're not as different as they want us to believe. If we can love each other, even in the middle of all this, maybe there's a way to make the others see that too." Mira was silent for a long moment, her gaze searching his as if trying to find some hidden truth. Then she smiled, a small, hopeful smile that made Eli's heart ache. "You always were the foolish one," she whispered, but there was no malice in her words, only affection. They spent the rest of the night planning, whispering about the impossible dream of peace. Eli knew it would not be easy. Convincing their leaders to even consider a truce was a task that bordered on insanity. But with Mira by his side, anything felt possible. If love could bloom on a battlefield, perhaps peace could too. The next morning, Eli returned to his camp, his mind racing with possibilities. He began speaking carefully to his comrades, planting seeds of doubt about the war. He asked quiet questions. Why were they still fighting? What were they truly defending? Did anyone even remember how the conflict had started? At first, the others brushed him off, too weary from battle to think beyond survival. But as the days passed, Eli noticed a subtle shift. His questions lingered in their minds, sowing tiny cracks in the foundation of their hatred. For the first time in years, his comrades began to wonder if there could be another way. Meanwhile, Mira faced her own challenges. Her superiors were growing suspicious of her absences, and her patrols became more frequent. Each time she slipped away to meet Eli, the risk of discovery grew, but she didn't care. For the first time in her life, she had found something worth fighting for. Not a cause, not a flag, but a person. Their love had given them both the courage to hope, and hope was a powerful thing. One evening, as they sat together beneath the stars, Mira leaned against Eli's shoulder, her hand entwined with his. "Do you think we'll ever have a future?" she whispered. Eli kissed the top of her head, his heart heavy with the weight of uncertainty. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know that I want one, with you." Mira smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "Me too." They sat in silence for a while, the vastness of the galaxy stretching out above them. In the quiet, Eli realized just how much he had changed since meeting Mira. He was no longer just a soldier following orders. He was a man in love, willing to defy the odds for the chance at something better. But love alone would not be enough. They needed a plan, something that would convince both sides to lay down their weapons and talk. And they needed allies, people who believed in peace as much as they did. Eli thought of his comrades, of the small flickers of doubt he had seen in their eyes. He thought of Mira's people, tired of a war that had lasted too long. There was hope if only they could find a way to ignite it. Mira must have sensed his thoughts, because she squeezed his hand and said, "We can do this, Eli. I believe in us." Eli smiled, the warmth of her faith in him filling the cracks that fear had left behind. "Then we'll find a way," he promised, "no matter what." They shared a kiss beneath the stars, a promise sealed not with words, but with love. It was a kiss that tasted of hope and defiance, of everything they dreamed of but dared not say aloud. The war was far from over, but Eli and Mira knew one thing: they were not alone. And as long as they had each other, they would keep fighting, not with weapons but with love. Because in a world consumed by hatred, love was the most powerful weapon of all. The war did not stop for love. It raged on, indifferent to the tender moments stolen beneath the stars. Every day, Eli and Mira felt the grip of conflict tighten around them. Their worlds pulled them in opposite directions, demanding loyalty to a cause that neither of them believed in anymore. Yet every time they met, their hearts refused to yield. It was as though the universe itself had carved out these moments for them, a sanctuary where they could be nothing more than Eli and Mira, two souls who had found each other in the chaos. Their meetings became increasingly dangerous. Patrols grew frequent, and whispers of spies circulated among the soldiers of both factions. Eli's heart pounded every time he slipped away from his camp, terrified that one of his comrades might follow him. The consequences of discovery would be swift and brutal, and not just for him. Mira would suffer too. But the thought of giving her up was unbearable. Love had made him reckless, and he knew it. He just didn't care. Mira faced the same risks. Her superiors were growing suspicious of her unexplained absences, and each meeting with Eli became a gamble. But she kept coming. Something about Eli, his hope, his stubborn belief that they could change the course of the war, ignited a fire in her. He had given her something that years of battle had stolen, a reason to believe in a future beyond the battlefield. They knew they couldn't hide forever. The weight of their love was becoming too heavy to carry in secret. Every kiss felt like a promise they couldn't keep. Every shared moment a borrowed time that would run out. And yet, they returned to each other, night after night, drawn together by a force they couldn't explain. One evening, as they sat together in the ruins of an old outpost, Mira rested her head on Eli's shoulder, her hand warm in his. "We can't keep doing this," she whispered, her voice heavy with sorrow. Eli kissed the top of her head. "I know," he murmured, "but what choice do we have?" Mira sat up, her violet eyes filled with determination. "We need to do more than just survive, Eli. We need to change this. If we don't, we'll never have a chance." Eli knew she was right. Every moment they spent hiding was a moment stolen from a future they could build. But how could two soldiers, trapped in the machinery of war, change the course of history? "I've started talking to my comrades," Eli said quietly. "Just small things. Questions about the war, about why we're still fighting. Some of them, they're starting to listen." Mira's eyes widened with hope. "You think they'll help us?" "Maybe," Eli admitted. "But we need more than just a few allies. We need a way to get both sides to listen, to see what we see." Mira nodded slowly, a plan forming in her mind. What if we came forward? She asked. What if we told them the truth about us, showed them that we're not enemies, not really? Eli stared at her, his heart pounding. You mean, reveal everything to everyone? Mira nodded. It's a risk, but it might be the only way. Eli knew the dangers. If they were caught, they would be branded as traitors, betrayers of their people. But he also knew that hiding wouldn't save them. If they wanted a future together, they would have to fight for it. Okay, he whispered, taking her hand. We'll do it, together. The next few days were a blur of preparations and whispered conversations. Eli spoke quietly with the soldiers he trusted most, testing their willingness to consider peace. To his surprise, many of them were tired of the endless conflict, desperate for a way out. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Mira faced a harder challenge. Her comrades were suspicious, and trust was a rare commodity among the Zara. But she found a few old friends who had grown weary of the war's toll. It was dangerous work, planting the seeds of doubt among warriors trained to obey without question. But Mira was determined. For Eli, for the chance at peace. Their meetings became even more dangerous as rumors of traitors spread through the ranks. Soldiers on both sides grew paranoid, searching for spies among their own. Eli and Mira knew it was only a matter of time before someone discovered the truth. One night, as they sat together beneath the stars, Eli took Mira's hands in his. This might be our last chance, he whispered. If they find out before we come forward. Mira pressed her forehead against his, her eyes closing. Then we don't wait. We tell them tomorrow. Eli's heart pounded, but he nodded. Tomorrow, he agreed. They shared a kiss beneath the night sky, a kiss filled with hope and fear and everything they couldn't say aloud. It was a kiss that tasted like the future they dreamed of, a future where love was stronger than war. The next morning, Eli stood before his comrades, his heart pounding in his chest. Mira stood beside him, her hand warm in his. The soldiers around them stared in disbelief, their faces a mixture of shock and confusion. We're not enemies, Eli said, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped him. Not anymore. Mira squeezed his hand, giving him the strength to continue. We've seen what war does, how it tears us apart, turns us against each other, but it doesn't have to be this way. A murmur spread through the crowd, a ripple of uncertainty and disbelief. Eli could see the doubt in their eyes, the fear of betrayal, but he also saw something else, hope, a flicker of understanding that maybe, just maybe, there was another way. We love each other, Eli said quietly, his voice carrying over the gathered soldiers, and that love has shown us that we're not so different, that there's still hope for peace. The soldiers exchanged glances, their expressions conflicted. Some looked angry, others confused, but a few, just a few, nodded, their eyes softening with understanding. Mira stepped forward, her violet eyes shining with determination. We're not asking you to trust us right away. We're asking you to listen, to think about what we've been fighting for, and if it's worth losing everything. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was not hostile. It was the silence of soldiers forced to confront the truths they had buried beneath years of battle. And in that silence, Eli felt the first stirrings of change. It was small, fragile, and uncertain, but it was enough. Mira turned to him, her hand tightening in his. Whatever happens next, she whispered, we face it together. Eli smiled, his heart full of love and hope. Together, they stood side by side, two warriors in love, ready to fight for a future worth living. The path ahead was uncertain, and the war was far from over. But for the first time, Eli and Mira believed that peace was possible, and that belief was the most powerful weapon of all. The fallout was swift and brutal. As soon as Eli and Mira revealed their relationship, both factions responded with outrage. Soldiers dragged Eli away from Mira's side, shoving him into a makeshift cell deep within his camp. Mira was treated even worse, bound, interrogated, and branded a traitor. Both factions saw their love not as a sign of peace, but as a betrayal of everything they stood for. Eli paced his cramped cell, fury and fear twisting in his gut. The walls around him seemed to close in tighter with every second, and his thoughts were consumed with worry for Mira. He imagined the worst: punishment, exile, or worse, execution. His fists clenched at the thought, helplessness settling over him like a heavy shroud. The sound of boots echoed in the hallway, and Eli turned toward the barred door just as his commanding officer, Lieutenant Arden, stepped into view. The older man's face was a mask of cold anger. Do you have any idea what you've done, Captain? Arden asked, his voice low and dangerous. You've disgraced your uniform, betrayed your comrades, you consorted with the enemy. Eli met Arden's glare without flinching. She's not my enemy, and you know this war has gone on too long. Arden scoffed. Spare me the speeches, Captain. You crossed a line, and now you'll answer for it." He leaned closer, his voice a cold whisper. "The council is preparing to execute her, and if you think your love story will save her, you're more of a fool than I thought." Eli's heart plummeted. "You can't do this," he said, desperation creeping into his voice. "Killing her won't end this war. It'll only make things worse." Arden straightened, his expression hard. "That's not your concern anymore." The lieutenant turned on his heel and marched out, leaving Eli alone with his despair. He sank onto the cold metal bench, his head in his hands, trying to think of a way, any way, to stop what was coming. Hours passed in agonizing silence, each second stretching into eternity. Then, just as the first light of dawn filtered through the narrow window, Eli heard the soft scrape of metal against metal. The door to his cell swung open, and he looked up to see a familiar figure standing in the doorway. Sergeant Tyler, one of his closest comrades. "Get up, Captain," Tyler whispered urgently. "We don't have much time." Eli shot to his feet, confusion and hope warring within him. "Tyler, what are you?" "Some of us believe in you, Eli," Tyler interrupted, his expression grim. "We're not all blind to what's going on. You were right. This war needs to end, and we're going to help you." Eli stared at his friend, disbelief washing over him. "You're risking everything." Tyler shrugged. "Some things are worth the risk." Without wasting another second, Eli followed Tyler through the winding corridors of the camp, avoiding patrols and slipping past checkpoints. When they reached the edge of the camp, Eli saw a small group of soldiers waiting, soldiers from both factions, united in their belief that love was stronger than hate. "We're not leaving without her," Eli said, his voice resolute. Tyler nodded. "We know. Let's move." They crossed the battlefield under cover of darkness, slipping into the enemy camp with practiced ease. Eli's heart pounded in his chest as they made their way toward the prison where Mira was being held. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every sound a potential discovery. But they pressed on, driven by the knowledge that time was running out. When they reached the prison, Eli spotted Mira through the bars of her cell. She looked exhausted, her arms bound in restraints, but her eyes lit up with relief when she saw him. "Eli," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "I'm here," Eli said, his heart aching at the sight of her. "We're getting you out." With Tyler's help, they disabled the guards and unlocked the cell. Mira stumbled into Eli's arms, and for a brief moment, the world around them faded away. They were together. That was all that mattered. "We have to go," Tyler urged, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "More patrols will be here soon." Eli nodded, keeping Mira close as they made their escape. The group moved swiftly, weaving through the camp and slipping back into the cover of the forest. They didn't stop until they reached the safety of neutral ground, a remote outpost abandoned long ago, where the war's reach did not extend. As dawn broke over the horizon, Eli and Mira stood side by side, their hands entwined. Around them, soldiers from both factions gathered, their faces filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. For the first time, enemies stood as equals, united by the belief that love was worth fighting for. Eli turned to Mira, his heart full of gratitude and love. "We made it," he whispered, pressing his forehead against hers. Mira smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "We're not done yet," she said softly, "but we have a chance, and that's more than we ever had before." Eli nodded, his grip tightening around her hand. Together, as the sun rose over the outpost, the small group of rebels prepared for the next step in their journey. They would send a message to the leaders of both factions, calling for a truce. It was a dangerous gamble, but it was the only way to end the war and build a future worth living for. Eli and Mira knew the road ahead would be difficult. There would be resistance, and not everyone would believe in their cause. But they also knew that they had already accomplished the impossible. They had found love on a battlefield, and that love would light the way forward. The message was sent that same day, a beacon of hope broadcast across the stars. It carried their story. Two soldiers from opposite sides, united by love and a shared dream of peace. It was a plea, a promise, and a challenge to those who still clung to hate. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty, but Eli and Mira faced them together. They knew the risks, knew that their love alone might not be enough to change the course of history, but they also knew that they had to try, because love, they had learned, was the most powerful force in the galaxy. It was stronger than fear, stronger than hate, and if it could survive the battlefield, it could survive anything. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Eli and Mira stood at the edge of the outpost, watching the stars appear in the night sky. The future was uncertain, but it was theirs to shape, together, and that was all they needed. The night stretched long as Eli and Mira waited for a response to their message. Each hour that passed weighed on them, uncertainty gnawing at their hearts. Their story, a beacon of love and hope, was now traveling across the galaxy, broadcast to leaders on both sides of the war. They had gambled everything on this message, believing that if anything could break through years of hatred, it was the truth about what they had found in each other. For days, silence followed. The soldiers at the remote outpost tried to keep up their spirits, but tension hung heavy in the air. Everyone knew the risks. If the message was ignored, if the factions decided that Eli and Mira were a threat instead of a symbol of hope, the response would come in the form of warships, not peace envoys. Eli sat on the edge of the outpost, staring at the stars. His hand was entwined with Mira's, and though the touch was comforting, his mind was restless. What if they don't listen? He whispered, voicing the fear that had plagued him since they sent the message. Mira leaned her head against his shoulder, her voice calm but filled with quiet determination. Then we keep trying. We fought for love. We can fight for peace too. Eli smiled, her words easing the tightness in his chest. Mira had always been his anchor, the steady force that kept him grounded. As long as they were together, he knew they could face whatever came next. The following morning, a crackling sound broke the tense stillness. A transmission. Every soldier at the outpost froze, and Eli's heart pounded in his chest. Tyler scrambled to the console, tuning the frequency as the message came through. It was short but clear. A meeting has been arranged. Both factions are sending representatives to discuss a ceasefire. Neutral ground. Dawn. Eli exchanged a look with Mira, hope flickering to life in their eyes. The message was a lifeline, a sign that their story had reached the right ears, but it was also just the beginning. The outpost erupted into activity as the rebels prepared for the meeting. There was no guarantee of peace. Both sides were sending envoys, but old wounds would not heal easily. Eli and Mira knew they would have to fight one last battle, not with weapons, but with words. The future of the galaxy depended on what happened next. As the first light of dawn touched the horizon, the representatives from both factions arrived. They came in small ships, cautious but curious, their faces marked by the weight of years spent in conflict. Eli and Mira stood side by side, ready to greet them. The Zera envoy, a stern woman with silver eyes, stepped forward, her gaze fixed on Mira. "You have brought us here to speak of peace," she said, her voice cold. "But why should we listen to traitors?" Mira held her ground, her expression unwavering. "Because this war has taken everything from us, from all of us, and if we don't stop now, it will take what little we have left." The human envoy, a grizzled man with a scar running down his cheek, folded his arms. "What makes you think peace is even possible? We've been fighting for so long, most of us have forgotten why." "That's exactly the problem," Eli said, stepping forward. "We've been at war for so long, we've lost sight of what we were fighting for in the first place. But Mira and I, we found each other in the middle of all this chaos. If we can see past the hatred, maybe others can too." There was a murmur among the gathered soldiers, a ripple of uncertainty that hinted at the possibility of change. The Zera envoy's expression softened just slightly, a flicker of understanding crossing her face. "What you ask is not easy," she said quietly. "Peace will take more than a handful of rebels with a dream." Mira nodded. "We know, but someone has to start. Let it be us." The meeting stretched through the morning and into the afternoon, a delicate dance of diplomacy and vulnerability. Both sides voiced their grievances, their pain laid bare for the first time in years. It was not an easy conversation, but it was a necessary one. As the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the outpost, the envoys exchanged weary but hopeful glances. The seeds of peace had been planted, fragile but alive. "Very well," the human envoy said at last. "We will take this truce to our leaders, and we will fight for peace, just as fiercely as we fought this war." The Zera envoy nodded. "As will we." Relief flooded through Eli, and he felt Mira squeeze his hand. They had done it. It wasn't the end of the journey, but it was a beginning, a chance to build something better. In the weeks that followed, the truce spread like wildfire through both factions. Old prejudices didn't disappear overnight, and there were those who resisted the idea of peace. But the story of Eli and Mira, two soldiers who had found love in the midst of war, became a beacon of hope across the galaxy. Soldiers laid down their weapons, tired of fighting battles with no end. Conversations replaced skirmishes, and slowly but surely, the tides of war began to recede. Eli and Mira stayed together through it all, helping to negotiate treaties and bridge the divides between their people. Their love became a symbol, not just of peace, but of the power of hope in the darkest times. On the day the final peace treaty was signed, Eli and Mira stood hand in hand before the gathered leaders of both factions. The war was over, and the galaxy was ready to heal. The crowd cheered as the treaty was sealed, but Eli knew the real victory was standing beside him, her violet eyes filled with joy and love. That night, As they lay beneath the stars, Mira rested her head against Eli's chest. "We did it," she whispered, her voice filled with quiet awe. "We really did it." Eli smiled, brushing a stray braid from her face. "We did," he murmured, "together." The stars above them sparkled with promise, the vast expanse of the galaxy waiting to be explored, not as enemies, but as partners. Their journey wasn't over, but they were ready for whatever came next, because they had learned that love was stronger than fear, stronger than hate, and as long as they had each other, they could face anything. The war was over, and a new dawn had begun. Eli and Mira had defied the odds, not just for themselves, but for everyone who believed that peace was possible, and their love would be remembered, forever written among the stars.